This is Roadmap to Resilience, an audio series for professionals and families who are supporting children experiencing stress and trauma. I'm Dr. Julian Ford.
And I'm Dr. Amanda Zelahusky. Whether you work with children or you have children of your own, this podcast is for you.
The stresses and traumas that a child may experience can range from a very specific and individual experience to larger community, national, and even global violence, crises, and disasters. And we've been discussing all throughout this series that it's actually the added layers of stress and trauma that can have the biggest negative impact. For example, take a child of color with a complex medical condition, and their family may also then face the added stressors of financial insecurity, community violence, and a flood or a wildfire impacting their hometown, layered on top of racism and the pandemic that are causing more global trauma. That's a lot of trauma.
Exactly, Amanda. The impact of these layers of collective trauma on children and families is evident when we take a moment and just think about the society and world in which a child lives. These widespread traumas are so ubiquitous that we can almost start taking them for granted as just the way things are. But we can't protect children and support their resilience if we overlook what they and their families and communities are dealing with when they face traumas that are embedded in the fabric of their community, their society, and that silently undermine their safety and health and development every day. In fact, the initial idea for this audio series came from a task force that was concerned about this very thing. We wanted to ensure that our scientific and public understanding of children's experiences of trauma, that understanding includes the dilemmas posed by traumas such as racism, war, community violence, and pandemics. Those traumas are so pervasive that we can mistakenly believe that there's nothing we can do about them.
Yes, and the pandemic lockdowns have kept us isolated from each other and also increased our stress and anxiety. I remember, my first thought when this all started was, this is the very thing we are afraid of as child trauma and child maltreatment scholars and clinicians, that this is going to get really bad. You have very stressed parents and caregivers locked in homes. Kids don't have access to their usual other outlets and support networks like schools and community activities. So because of these concerns, this episode includes several conversations about the specific traumas that come not only from the pandemic, but we also touch on how other collective traumas like war and civil unrest can impact children.
Here's psychologist Dr. Sandra Rafman, who's worked extensively with disaster-affected youth.
Children's experiences, their perception, and particularly their suffering is just not recognized or underestimated or misdiagnosed, or just so hard for adults when they are unable in situations like pandemics, earthquakes, wars, when they are just so much want to protect children and often just heartbreaking not to be able to. Then often children also don't want to upset their parents. They themselves will silence themselves. So I think certain things are just so painful for us to see with regard to our kids that we don't see it. In studying different traumatic events, you couldn't plan so that there wouldn't be uncertainty. It just seemed like it was really important to think about what we were going to do about children's distress in the setting.
Often when big things are happening in the world, the immediate mindset might be, how do we survive this? Without giving much thought initially to how children are processing and coping. In our previous episode, Understanding Dissociation, we spoke extensively with clinical psychologist Dr. Joyanna Silberg, who specializes in care for children experiencing dissociation or disconnection from themselves during or after a traumatic experience. In that conversation, Dr. Silberg mentioned that she has seen an increase in children with dissociative symptoms during the pandemic. Here she is explaining why she thinks that's the case.
I think it's a combination of just a general level of heightened anxiety about everything that makes a little trauma feel like a bigger trauma, combined with more time alone, less time to be with peers. Now, one of the most healing things that you can do with a dissociative child is have them play with somebody who's non-dissociative. because that child has to be right there in themselves. They've got to be inside of themselves to react to that other kid really quickly. It's a very context dependent moment each time they have to change. And if they're missing those experiences, even the experiences in school, they may begin to go more and more internal. And then there's another thing that I've discovered is there are kids who are spending huge amounts of time on the internet during the pandemic. And some of them are finding websites with all kinds of interesting disorders that people have. And some of my clients were talking to people who have adults who have dissociative identity disorder and decided, well, that explains me perfectly. And then came in telling me their whole diagnosis because of spending so much time online in these self-help groups. Or some kids have traumatized themselves by finding really horrible sites online and gotten involved in really sadistic kind of imagery, which even that kind of vicarious witnessing can be very traumatic for children.
I wondered if the combination of isolation and the potential intense contagion that can happen when kids, or any of us, but especially kids, are online and just picking up all kinds of information from all kinds of sources. It does seem like that would be a really powerful combination for kids just to feel confused about, am I different people, or do I just feel different ways at different times, and I have moods, and helping kids and parents without minimizing the potential for dissociation, but helping them to not believe that every one of these kinds of experiences is a serious dissociative problem.
Well, another thing, as you're talking to me, what I'm thinking of is, are you just a box? Are you just a person in a box, or are you a person? Some children didn't meet their teachers, and some of my clients never met their teachers all year and just saw them in a box. Some kids did finally meet their teachers, and then they had to make the leap. Some of them distinguished between friends that were just in a box or friends that they actually knew in real life. And I would say, do you have any friends? And they would say, you mean Zoom, or do you mean like real people? So like, are they real people or not real people? I think that adds to both a sense of fluidity of identity and a confusion about identity and how you relate to yourself and others.
Here's Dr. Apryl Alexander, who's an associate professor in the Graduate School of Professional Psychology at the University of Denver. Dr. Alexander is going to speak with us about her concerns for youth during the pandemic.
Yeah, I've been afraid as our youth have been going back to schools because we know during the COVID-19 pandemic that in so many different states and places across the world, hotline calls for domestic violence have increased, hotline calls for child abuse have increased. So what does that mean now that we're opening back our world, quote unquote, and our youth are returning to schools? I said we might see even higher reports of abuse because they're going to be around their mandatory reporters again. So are we going to have the capacity to support those youth? Also going back and thinking about what did their last year look like? They didn't have all of the supports from community. Here in Denver, we are seeing rates of youth violence go up because where did they have to go? Their community centers might have been closed. Their libraries weren't available. Their sports teams weren't available. So there was a lot going on last year where our youth just didn't have those supports that they needed in order to thrive and just be youth. One thing that scared me last year is a local reporter was interviewing teachers about their experiences with their youth during this time of online learning. And this one teacher reported, I haven't heard from 5 of my students. That's scary. Where's that child? Where's that family? Are they okay? And so, as we're kind of moving forward, I'm thinking about what were the implications of this last year on our youth and what are the supports that they need as they're going back into the school year.
We also spoke with Dr. Viola Vaughan-Eden, who's an associate professor and PhD program director with the Ethlyn R. Strong School of Social Work at Norfolk State University. What are your thoughts about how the COVID pandemic and all of the changes and some of the ways in which we've had to be more separate from others in our lives? How has that impacted children who may also be dealing with the trauma or the injury of sexual abuse?
Right. So, I think the first concern that I had when we went on lockdown, when I first heard we were going on lockdown, was, oh no, there are too many children that how are they going to eat? Who's going to feed these children? Because so many children we know get their primary meals at school during the day. And then there are a number of schools that have what's called backpack programs where they send food home for children over the weekend or for the family over the weekend. So my first anxiety was just thinking that there are going to be so many children out there that will not be fed. But then, of course, as a child abuse person, the next thing was what's going to happen to children who are locked down and isolated with their alleged offenders or with their actual perpetrators. It took a moment, I think, to not only manage my anxiety, but my colleagues around the country, because we were all clearly emailing, calling, Zooming to say, oh no, what can be done? For many parents, especially parents of teenagers or young adults, to have the opportunity to have that child be back home and reconnect was a very positive moment for many families. But for families who experience abuse, we have an extremely stressful situation that then completely exacerbated the symptoms and fears and worries of further abuse and trauma. So very, very overwhelming. I think one of the things that was important for many kids was having that opportunity to Zoom, whether it's with a teacher or other relatives throughout the day. But I do think we don't really appreciate yet the extent to what harm has been done through the isolation. I will say when I talked with my physician colleagues that are forensic pediatricians, what they're telling me is that, yes, the numbers are down, but then when they actually see a child, the severity of the abuse is that much greater. Mm-hmm. So what we suspect is happening is that children are being abused because they're not around any mandated reporters. There's no one seeing and no one for them to tell. However, once the abuse has crossed the line where it's caused extreme physical injury, a parent has a choice of taking them to the emergency room, to the doctor, because they certainly don't want to allow them to die. So I'm not sure where we're going to land on this one. It's very frightening on many levels. But I do think as we start opening up again, I'm hoping that, and I'm going to say child protection professionals, but I mean teachers, I mean, counselors, whether it's counselors at churches or just any youth serving organization or person, will have that opportunity to talk to kids and give them that space that they may need to share what their experiences really were while they were on lockdown. So I know that's not a direct answer, but I do think that it's a real important next phase for us is to hear, let's not make assumptions, but let's hear from them about what really occurred.
The pandemic lockdowns kept us at home. And they also meant for both ourselves and our children that we were online a lot more, for many of us more than we've ever been. And while digital spaces were great to keep us connected, they actually also opened up avenues for increased online sexual abuse. Here's Dr. Michael Salter, the Scientia Associate Professor of Criminology at the University of New South Wales. His research focuses on child sexual exploitation and technology-facilitated abuse.
So early on last year, I was lucky to receive some funding from the Australian Safety Commissioner to look at the particular impact of COVID-19 on the risk of online child sexual exploitation. And part of that included looking at the dark web and looking at offender communities on the dark web. And unfortunately, the dark web provides child sex abusers with a very safe space to congregate and sort of share information and encourage each other to abuse and so on. And what we saw quite early on in COVID-19 was firstly a lot of online offenders complaining that the pandemic had interrupted their access to children. These were people that were offending offline, but once lockdown occurred, essentially kids were at home, so they no longer had access to the kids that they were abusing in kind of real life, as it were. And so there was quite a decided pivot for online offenders to the online space. Now, I mean, technology unfortunately provides sex offenders with a lot of opportunities to access children. And that's not inherent in the nature of technology. We do need to recognize that social media platforms have been designed in a very unsafe way. And you know, I've always been a firm advocate for corporate responsibility in this area, that these platforms just are not child safe and child friendly. We were all spending more time online because of the pandemic. Kids were, of course, online more because of online learning and socializing and lockdown. Adults were online more, of course. And then we have this shift in the online offender community towards looking for opportunities to access kids online, sharing strategies between each other about how to lure and groom children. And unfortunately, some offenders are highly, highly specialized in doing this and very strategic in their efforts to overcome kids' inhibitions and manipulate and coerce them in all sorts of ways. And all of the global indicators that we've seen over the last 12 months show that online offences against children have increased significantly.
So, Michael, I'm wondering, with this terrible influx, in some sense, from the offender community, what can parents do to protect their children from online sexual exploitation?
Yeah, really important question, Julian. And I think, you know, just situating it more broadly within the anxiety of the pandemic and the fact that often parents might be on lockdown with their children, but it doesn't mean that they're easily able to supervise their children, especially parents who, of course, have to work at the same time as expecting their child sometimes to take a lot of responsibility for online learning, because that's the only way that they can sort of make it happen. I think there's a number of things that parents can think about. And the first is just staying really open with their kids and having a dialogue with their kids. One of the things that offenders do is they really manipulate children's shame. So they'll tell kids, you know, if you tell anyone, you'll get in so much trouble. You know, your parents will be so angry at you, or the police will come to your door. You've done something terrible. And so it's really important that parents impress on children that there's this ongoing conversation about what's happening on the internet. It's an open one. It's a fairly non-judgmental one. And sometimes just saying, if you get in trouble, you know, online, if something happens, you can always come to me. I won't be angry, right? I'll help you. I'll help you out. So that's really important, and it takes a key kind of tool of manipulation away from the offenders. And also just being familiar with the online spaces that your kids are in, playing online with them sometimes, you know, exploring the app with them, having a clear understanding and clear line of sight about what their online world looks like. And last but not least, just setting rules, setting boundaries about screen time, about what is and isn't okay online. And always just developing that trust that your child has, that they can talk to you about what's happening.
Here's Dr. Sandra Rafman again.
Well, now what we've seen with the COVID pandemic is that, completely surprising, I think, to most of us, it's the adults who are most likely to be severely affected, to be hospitalized. And of course, some children have been, and that's not to be taken lightly. But I wonder, what are your thoughts about what's most helpful for a child when a parent suddenly has to go to the hospital and is very, very ill, maybe is having trouble breathing? That, I would imagine, that would be terrifying for children. And what can the other parent or caregivers do? What can the hospital do to help those children while they're also trying to keep the adult alive?
There's not one answer to that, obviously, in the different situations, and depends on what is available. But I think for me, the first thing, or one of the first things, is just to acknowledge the situation, like to actually recognize what is happening, and that the child really sees what is happening. It might have even seen it before you, probably did. Of all the different stress or traumatic situations, for potentially traumatic situations, the child often was the one to recognize not just the danger of death. They were like the first to see that death was a risk, it was a possibility. Separation was definitely a possibility. Instead of making it look better than it is, if you can't really reassure, don't, because it just makes the child feel much more isolated, much more alone.
I think you hit on something very important here, is just to emphasize that children see and know more than we think. And
Absolutely.
they don't, and they're not reassured by statements that are not true.
Exactly.
They don't need to hear about details that are too horrifying, but they do need to have their own perceptions validated. I know that you're really interested, and you've done some really interesting work on helping children and using the approach of paradox to understand complexity. This may not be an example of that, but it strikes me that there is a potential paradox here, where on the one hand, we want the child to feel safe. And on the other hand, we want them to know that we understand that they don't feel safe and that there's a risk. And in that, I see a real important paradox. What can make global traumas particularly difficult for children to cope with is that there aren't often clear answers as to why these traumas are happening and who is responsible.
They're looking to live in a moral universe. They're not just looking to live like, oh, mommy and dad are there and everything. They want things to be just. They want things to be benevolent. They want it for themselves, but they also want it for their loved ones. So they're looking, how can I make a moral universe out of this? And to see that they're struggling for that, and to see it in their actual words and play, they're co-constructors of the social world. They're starting young, and they're telling you from very young, because they have empathy from very young. They feel that children who do something really hard, or other people who do things to harm people, it's a worse crime than bad table manners. So, like moral transgressions should be more punished than social action. But you see, the thing that happens like in a war or in a pandemic is that everything is disrupted. The usual assumptions are shaken for the adults as well, like who's the good guy, who's the bad guy. This was done a lot in the Bosnian War. So who was friend, who wasn't, and who was right, and you had different theories of it. So assumptions about how the world is organized are disrupted for their culture, for their family, for everybody. So they're in the middle of a disruption, and so are the adults. And so reconstructing meaning is much harder. Now we see that so much, like in our political situations, like it's gotten it's so disrupted. How do you make sense of it? It's hard for the parents, and so it's going to be harder to do it for the kids.
Could an answer perhaps sometimes, and I realize you're making a wonderful point, that there is no one size that fits all for every child.
Oh, absolutely.
Could an answer be, if a child says, why is this happening? Could it be, I don't know exactly why it's happening, but I know that you want things to be fair, and you want people to be treated right, and you want people to do the right things. And that's something that we share, that I want that too. So we're together and wanting things to be right. In our field, in psychology, there's some really interesting research, and I don't claim to be an expert on it at all. I just know a little bit about it. And it's all about in-group versus out-group.
Right.
And I prefer to think of it a little more simply, and that is us versus them.
Right.
I think what you're describing is that in this pandemic, and perhaps in other disasters like the earthquake from Haiti, and the political violence that has occurred in Haiti and over many, many generations, that children are exposed frequently to situations and people who basically point a finger of blame at some others, or describe others as the enemy or the source of all the problems. And it's that us versus them thinking Is that something that you see children try to grapple with when you give them a chance to just play creatively and express themselves?
Very much so, but I would even, let's say, rephrase, but what I do see, children recognize when you're treated as valuable with dignity, and they argue for that, and they're puzzled when it's not happening. So in the war situation, the bad guys, the good guys, but they're puzzled. We're not supposed to kill. So how do we get the social sanctioning of killing? So I have kids where parents have just been disappeared or been murdered, and then there's a description of how they were found, or you get them replaying that description, but making it not, if they were found bloody and mutilated, they're not bloody, they're found. So they take away the sometimes the intentionality of destroying the parent. It's more like the equity issue. So there's the loss, there's the interaction of the pain and agony of losing and separated from a loved one, but there's also why did this happen? There's an outrage, and why, so there's a combination of the moral outrage and the pain of separation. Children want to, like adults, would like a fair universe. So they want things to go right. They want things to be fair. So they often will present things that constructed as fair. So in that sense, it's very helpful to listen how they're sorting things out. Even just acknowledging that there's contradictions. For me, it's horrific that we didn't even prepare a vaccine. We went along and prepared vaccines for people, and nobody prepared anything for kids. You don't think that they noticed?
For better or worse, the pandemic has shaped our global community in irreversible ways. For mental health and medical providers, our approach to how we provide care has been hugely impacted. We spoke with Dr. Archana Basu, a clinical psychologist and instructor in the Division of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at Massachusetts General Hospital and Harvard Medical School.
We're all also affected, even as we're helping families cope with the impact of the pandemic. So in terms of training and supervision, really, it's, I think, starting with actually getting to know our trainees in ways that we haven't had to before, through these virtual meetings, and getting to know what the pandemic experience has been for them, what questions or worries they might bring in terms of their training experience to this. And that is, part of it is the professional experience, part of it is the unique challenges in their own personal lives at times. So I think adapting training programs and clinical supervision to the pandemic has, in fact, been not just a logistical challenge, but also really fundamentally rethinking how we, train future mental health professionals. I will say that, we know that right now in the pandemic, the mental health needs have grown exponentially. And we expect that the longer term reverberations will continue. So there, even before the pandemic, we knew that getting mental health services was not easy to navigate. So of course I said, check in with your primary care provider, think about ways to, get further screening. But we also know that mental health resources were already stretched thin before the pandemic. This is especially true for children, and even more so when we think about children under the age of 6. So the need for mental health professionals, psychologists, social workers, psychiatrists, but really all types of mental health professionals has grown a lot. Another element of this training piece has been thinking about what are some new ways of engaging families, new needs and challenges that have come up in this kind of Zoom virtual care world. And what are ways in which training programs have to then train these future mental health professionals to meet them. So when we do trauma-focused work, for example, this is a fairly unique challenge because when there are issues of safety involved, not all homes are safe. And virtual assessments and care are not always the appropriate way to do those assessments or the most helpful way to do them. So I think that's been a unique challenge. For children, younger kids, doing virtual sessions can sometimes be more challenging than adolescents. So thinking about creative ways to engage children and families. Sometimes it can also just be issues of privacy. Not everyone has, the space and, a separate room in the same way that a therapy office or a hospital system can provide. So when we think about something as simple as the frame of the therapy session, both in terms of physical boundaries, rituals, it's a different mindset. You're talking about getting up and walking around, but it's the same thing when we're going to therapy. We have a ritual that's built into our day. We get on the bus or the car or the train and go to the therapist's office. It's all part of that anticipatory preparation to be in therapy. That ritual is now gone. So if you're home and you were, talking to a friend and then you switch into therapy, sometimes there's been occasions when we've had parents or teens actively doing something else that they need to attend to while they're supposed to be in therapy, right? So, where is their emotional state and their mental state? So these are just some of examples, I guess, of how the frame has changed in the pandemic, and I think has introduced kind of new elements to the training program, while also recognizing that we really need to scale up as we prepare for this. I guess the last point I would make is in this pandemic, we know that many executive orders allowed for billable remote care, both virtual sessions and often phone sessions. And I think that some of these changes have also been incredibly valuable. So even though I highlighted some of the challenges, I think they've also been very valuable. And there's certainly some evidence to suggest, in my own experience, I can tell you that parents sometimes, they don't miss the 2-hour commute. They don't miss the parking challenges. They really don't have time and they appreciate the easy access. Where I work, which is in Boston, Massachusetts has now made remote care permanently reimbursable at parity with in-person sessions. I don't think, again, like I said, it's the way or the model for everyone or every concern, but I think having that flexibility so that we can use it as needed, I think has been really, really helpful, and also part of the training and supervision and programs.
Yeah, completely changing the ways we need to be training emerging mental health professionals,
Yeah.
requiring everybody to be comfortable with virtual service delivery was not something I think any of us were trained in graduate school. So yeah, it'd be really interesting to see how the landscape changes. I'm thinking about how many families you've worked with this year, and I'm really curious what your sort of 10,000-foot view is, right? What are the issues that you've been seeing emerge for families this year, and who specifically are those most vulnerable groups that we need to keep our eye out for in the months and years ahead?
So that is actually a big part of my hat on the population-based sort of approaches and research that I do. And I think when we think about population level approaches, the one thing I would say is that all population level sort of approaches are fundamentally cross-sector collaborations. And what I mean by that is, we often talk about mental health programs and interventions in a somewhat disconnected manner from thinking about other economic needs for families and communities. But I think one thing that is really, really important in thinking about future policies, and we're already starting to see some of that, is mental health approaches really need to be thought of in collaboration with other economic kind of interventions. And so what I mean by that, just to give very specific examples, is that when we think about issues of food insecurity, which increased dramatically in the pandemic, childhood poverty, digital infrastructure in schools, ventilation in schools, housing stability, all of which we know impact mental health, not just directly for children, but also, parental mental health and parent-child relationships. One way to think about this is all of these policies actually have implications for health and mental health. I recently heard Grand Rounds by Dr. Ruth Shim, a very inspiring and thoughtful person who sort of said, all policies are health policies. The flip side of this, I guess, is healthcare alone is not enough to address the mental health needs that are clearly growing. So in essence, when we think about population-based approaches, yes, there's a lot of investment scaling up that is needed for building our mental health infrastructure. But importantly, by themselves, they are not enough to address, the sources of stress, the sources of insecurity and instability that families are experiencing. So cross-sector collaborations that are about thinking about school infrastructure, whether it's ventilation with how do we build up capacity in schools for mental health professionals? That would be one sort of, example. So economic policies with mental health policies, I think, is one sort of clear example of what I mean when I say cross-sector kind of approaches.
Here's Dr. Viola Vaughan-Eden again, speaking to the ways cultural stigma can deter individuals from seeking or receiving the trauma-informed care they need, and how the pandemic layered on more challenges.
I happen to teach at a historically Black university. So about 80% of my students are African American. And in our social work department, I require them to share about their personal experiences with families. And the common theme is we don't talk about our business outside of the family. And I don't think that's just African American families. I think that's many families. But when you're not supposed to share the business outside the family, and now all of a sudden you're on lockdown, maybe your home isn't the home that you want people to see on Zoom. And I say that in part because even as a college professor, I know that's been a challenge for a number of our college students. So we know it's a challenge for the children. So it's about an invasion of space, or Zoom takes us into private spaces that in the past, we've been very confident that we don't want to share. We can close that bedroom door, and if we didn't make our bed, no one knows it. But if that's the only space we have to Zoom from, all of a sudden it definitely almost feels like an intrusion for many people. And then for parents who are already experiencing stress, whether it's mental health issues, whether it's financial stress because of job loss or job insecurity, it really does add a level of pressure to families. And I think the shocking part for me, someone who grew up in the South, who grew up in a state that has struggled. In fact, Virginia was the capital of the Confederacy. So we've dealt with racism in all avenues, all branches for many, many years and still do. I think having the pandemic and then having the amount of racial unrest all happening at the same time just seemed like an overwhelming multitude of traumas. And I know we haven't recovered from that because I think people are just not even sure how to respond or who they can feel safe with. Growing up for me was one in which overall I was raised to trust and believe that I'm safe with police and I can go to the police if I have a problem. But I know so many children now are seeing that they can't do that. And even though it's a small number of police that have been involved in some of the racial issues, it's still sending, the wrong message. As a social worker, I always tell my students, or I ask my students like the first day of class, so, tell me about social workers. What do people think of social workers? And invariably, one of the first answers is, it's the person or the people that take away your children. So just like we're scrutinizing police, social workers have always been scrutinized because most people see us as those that may take away your children or those that are telling you that you're doing something wrong with your children. I think recognizing that if, like Dr. Ford said earlier, if things in communities are going to improve, we have to be willing to listen to each other and be willing to support one another and protect one another. So maybe it isn't your child that's experiencing an abusive situation or a hunger situation, but be willing to reach out to your neighbor or your neighbor's child or your child's friend from school to say, oh, it's okay if you have dinner here at our house today, or it's okay if we study together. It's okay if you talk to me about something that someone else has done. So I think it's in some ways it sounds very old-fashioned because it's much the way my mother said that she was raised, a sense of community where if you did something wrong at school, everyone in the community knew about it, and you might have consequences from neighbors, not just parents. But there was a sense or a level of caring and involvement that I think as we've become such a mobile society that sometimes we just don't slow down enough to listen.
So you've mentioned how challenging it has been in the pandemic for kids, for families. What do you think we all need to be doing in order to be able to shift out of pandemic mode and get back to our lives? Because in some ways, it's almost like we've had to disconnect, and it's not dissociation, but it's very similar. How do you recommend that we all think about reconnecting with our lives now that we're beginning to emerge from the pandemic?
When you feel ready to do the things that you wanted to do before, don't be afraid when you're with others to talk about how weird it seems and how either grateful, frightened, whatever. Make those conversations feeling conversations. And I hope teachers will do that on the first day of school when the kids come back. Whoo! What is it like to be back? What do you think? What do you think? I thought I'd never see school again. I thought, let's make it into an ongoing feelings conversation as we re-enter. And I think that will give us a sense of solidarity and community and help us air both our fears and our gratitude and our relief all together.
The kids have really suffered during this pandemic, and we could have more helpful things to do in our suggestions. They were torn from their schools. They were torn from their grandparents. They were torn from their friends. Their parents were upset. Like, it's not everybody, but so many. And we don't really acknowledge it yet. Like, we haven't really admitted to how much we've demanded of them. They're supposed to be quiet and go stay at home and do their home learning and wear their mask and not see their friends. And they did it. How painful it was and hard it was for kids. Really, they haven't been recognized. They should all be getting medals.
Oh, what a wonderful way of thinking of children as they are just as much our heroes as the adults on the front lines. They have done things that have taken great courage, great stamina, great perseverance. Right. Sticking with their values.
Yep.
They protected us
so much.
They protected their grandparents. They protected their parents. They protected us from getting upset. They didn't want to see us fighting, so they did whatever. It's amazing what children did.
And it's wonderful to be able to celebrate that and celebrate children and their resilience with you, Sandra.
Right. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I so have this. I'll say it towards the end because they might cut it up. Like, I hate the word resilience.
Say it.
I mean,
why?
No, because sometimes I don't like the way it's used. Like, a child suffers, so you say, "Oh, don't worry, kids are resilient." It's like another way of protecting us from the pain of seeing their pain. I just don't want it misused, put it
right,
that way.
Like a crutch or an easy out because we just dismiss it. Right.
Like, don't worry, they're resilient. Don't worry, they're resilient.
That's exactly why we're doing this series, I think, because Julian and I were also frustrated with the assumption that the kids will just be fine. And so let's bring together all of these people to really talk about what makes them fine and the work we need to do to help them.
Just because kids are resilient doesn't mean that they don't suffer.
Right.
Exactly.
It doesn't mean that they don't need our protection and our care. You know, Amanda, as I was listening to Dr. Rafman draw to a close this episode, it really struck me how crucial it is for us to remember that children are really our heroes. They don't often feel like heroes and they don't often get the credit they deserve, but their resilience is so remarkable when we think about the incredible kinds of challenges that we're facing in our world, whether it's war or natural disasters or a pandemic, and children just weather those crises. It's not that they don't take a toll, and it's not that children aren't affected. They're deeply affected, as are their families. But their resilience is so inspiring. And I think that's really what we need to keep in mind when we think about the massive kinds of collective traumas that are affecting all of us in our lives. We also need to remember that we have some heroes, and they're often right by our side.
Yeah, and these certainly weren't the first, global and collective traumas we've endured as a society and species, and they certainly won't be the last. And so not only have they been our heroes, I think they've also been our most important teachers through all of this. When we're trying to figure out what it is that they need and how we can best support them, as we keep coming back to again and again, the best thing to do is to listen and let them guide us. And so they absolutely have been doing that throughout this pandemic and many of the global and collective traumas that our experts talked about with us. Many thanks to our guest experts on this episode, Dr. Apryl Alexander, Dr. Archana Basu, Dr. Sandra Rafman, Dr. Michael Salter, Dr. Joyanna Silberg, and Dr. Viola Von Eden.
Visit roadmaptoresilience.org to learn more about our guest experts, access additional videos and resources, or send us a message.
If this episode piqued your interest, we'd love for you to leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts and let us know what you think. And if you imagine this episode would resonate with a colleague or friend, please share it.
Roadmap to Resilience is a collaboration between Pandemic Parenting and the University of Connecticut School of Medicine, with special thanks to the Interorganizational Child Trauma Task Force.
Roadmap to Resilience is produced by my co-hosts, Dr. Julian Ford, myself, Dr. Amanda Zelahusky, along with Carmen Vincent and Victoria Bruick. Many thanks to Jennifer Valentine for her strategic support, and to the teams at Pandemic Parenting and the Center for the Treatment of Developmental Trauma Disorders for providing promotional support.
We'd also like to thank the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration's National Child Traumatic Stress Network for their financial support of this project.
Thank you for joining us in supporting children in need of a roadmap to resilience.